I am Mike D, and this is the history of money, banking, and trade. Here's what I want you to think about. Every financial system you interact with today, every bank, every currency, every credit arrangement is the product of thousands of years of human ingenuity, necessity, and occasionally spectacular failure. This podcast is the story of how it all began, evolved, and became the world we live in. We're starting in the ancient world, and we're not stopping until we reach the present. Welcome aboard. Today, we're telling one of the greatest stories in all of ancient history, and honestly, one of the most consequential stories in all of human history. It's the story of two civilizations that started as distant trading partners, circled each other for centuries with a mixture of respect and suspicion, and then tore the Mediterranean world apart in three wars that would determine the fate of Western civilization. It is the story of Rome and Carthage. And here's what I want you to keep in mind as we go through this. For most of the story, it was not obvious that Rome was going to win, not even close. Let us start at the very beginning. The year is 509 BCE. In Rome, something extraordinary is happening. The Romans have just thrown out their last king, Tarquinius Superbus, or Tarquinian the Proud, and then they establish a republic. It's the founding moment of one of history's great political experiments. And according to Roman tradition, in that same year, Rome signed its very first international treaty. The treaty was not with an Italian city, not with Greece, but with Carthage. We know about this treaty primarily because of the Greek historian Polybius, writing several centuries later, claimed to have read the original document. And what it reveals is fascinating, not so much for what it says about the friendship, but for what it says about power. It's worth noting that at this moment, Rome is a regional power of middling importance in central Italy, respectable, growing, but fundamentally local. Carthage, on the other hand, was the dominant commercial empire of the Western Mediterranean. Its trade network stretched across North Africa, Sicily, Sardinia, and Spain. Its merchant ships were everywhere. Its wealth was extraordinary. If you had to bet in 509 BCE on which of these two cities would eventually rule the known world, you would not have bet on Rome. In fact, it would have been interesting to see what the odds makers would have been if this was on a modern-day Kalshi or Polymarket. My guess is that it probably would have been somewhere around 95% going to Carthage. And that treaty reflected that completely. Roman merchants faced strict limitations on where they could operate in Carthaginian-controlled waters. Carthage faced no equivalent restrictions in the Roman territory. This is Carthage's sphere, Sicily, Sardinia, North Africa, and Rome, you stay in Italy. It's less a partnership between two equals and more of the kind of arrangement of a dominant power making with a manageable neighbor. Think of it like a private equity manager conveying the view that you should consider yourself lucky that we're willing to take your money at all. Some modern scholars debate whether the treaty actually dates to 509 BCE, or whether it was signed somewhere later, possibly in the late 5th or early 4th century BCE. The dating matters more than it might initially seem. If the treaty really is contemporaneous with the Roman Republic's founding, it means Carthage was engaging Rome diplomatically from its very first year as a republican state, which suggests Carthage was watching Rome closely and early. But whether the treaty is from 509 or a generation later, what it reveals about the power dynamic is not in dispute. Rome accepted the Carthage terms. Before we go further, let's take a moment to understand what Carthage actually was. because it tends to get flattened out in popular history into the villain of the Hannibal story, and it deserves considerably more than that. Carthage began as a Phoenician trading colony, traditionally founded around 814 BCE by settlers from the city of Tyre on the coast of what is now Lebanon. The Phoenicians were among the greatest maritime traders and navigators the ancient world has ever produced, probably the world's first true sea power. They gave us the alphabet. They sailed as far as Britain for tin, and they may have circumvented Africa centuries before the Europeans attempted it. Military conquest wasn't in their civilization's DNA. Commerce was. Over time, Carthage outgrew its colonial origins and became a fully independent power from its own political institutions, its own culture, and its own imperial reach. Kind of reminds me similar to how the United States kind of derived out of the British. Those institutions were impressive enough to attract the attention of Aristotle, who in his politics praised the Carthaginian constitution as one of the notable government systems of the ancient world. It balanced aristocratic councils with elected magistrates and a popular assembly, a mixed government that Aristotle associated with stability and good governance. Both civilizations were deeply commercial, and both developed a prominent religious tradition around trade. Rome had Mercury, whose very name comes from the Latin merx, meaning merchandise. He was the divine patron of commerce, financial gain, travelers, and appropriately enough, thieves. The Carthaginians had their own Phoenician deities, principally Melkart and Baal-Hamon, who Romans later mapped onto their own gods through a practice historians call interpretatio Romana. Two commercial cultures, independently, made the god of trade one of their most prominent deities. Because of course they did. The 509 BCE treaty was not the last word between Rome and Carthage. By 348 BCE, over a century and a half later, the two powers were back at the negotiating table, and the new terms revealed just how much had changed. Rome in 348 BCE is a considerably more formidable state. It had survived the Gallic sack of 390 BCE, a genuine traumatic shock that burned the city, humiliated its armies, and lodged itself permanently in the Roman cultural memory as a warning about complacency. Recovery from it drove military reform and institutional toughening. Rome had also been steadily absorbing its Italian neighbors through a combination of conquest and integration, building a manpower base that would eventually make it unstoppable. And yet, the new treaties still favored Carthage. Romans could trade freely in Carthaginian Sicily, but they were barred from Sardinia, Spain, and Africa. Carthage, on the other hand, could retain free access to Roman territory. Rome could not establish colonies in Carthaginian-controlled areas. Each side was essentially agreeing to stay in its lane, and each side was getting exactly what it needed at the moment. Carthage's entire civilization was oriented around long-distance maritime trade. Rome, meanwhile, was still fundamentally a land power focused on territorial expansion in Italy. The overseas commercial restrictions cost Rome almost nothing that it actually wanted. Then there's the Third Treaty, supposedly from 306 BCE. This is where things get generally murky. No original document survives. We know about it only through later Roman sources. The same Roman sources who have obvious incentives to dismiss it, because if it existed, it would have drawn a clean line. Romans stay out of Sicily. Carthaginians stay out of Italy. And if that line existed, then Rome's decision to send troops into Sicily in 264 BCE, the trigger for the First Punic War, was a clear violation. Most modern historians think the treaty probably existed. The Romans' convenient amnesia about this document is in itself a form of evidence for its existence. By around 300 BCE, The Mediterranean world had been transformed. A handful of cities, Rome, Carthage, Alexandria, and Antioch, had crossed the 100,000 population threshold, placing them in a different category from ordinary urban centers. The broader Mediterranean basin contains somewhere between 35 and 50 million people, roughly double the population of 3 centuries earlier. Competition for resources was intensifying. Grain, timber, silver, manpower, the foundations of ancient power, were becoming strategic goods in ways they had not been before. Carthage was wealthy by any ancient standard. Gold flowed in from the trans-Saharan trade networks, reaching deep into West Africa. Silver came from mines in southeastern Spain. Its merchant fleet connected markets from the Atlantic coast to the eastern Mediterranean. Its armies were formidable, though notably were largely mercenary, which meant their loyalty was financed rather than patriotic. That distinction would matter. Rome's trajectory during the same period was defined by something different: military expansion and, crucially, institutional resilience. The Samnites, Rome's most serious Italian rivals, had been defeated across 3 brutal wars, and Rome had developed a distinctive approach to the people it had conquered. Rather than simply subjugating them, it integrated them into their expanding alliance system, granting various degrees of Roman citizenship, and drew on their manpower for its armies. This was not generosity, it was strategic genius. And then came Pyrrhus. Pyrrhus of Epirus was one of the great generals of the Hellenistic world, so gifted that Hannibal himself repeatedly ranked him among the finest commanders in history. When the Greek cities of southern Italy appealed to him for protection against Roman expansion, he came with a professional Hellenistic army, complete with war elephants, and defeated Roman forces in several engagements. And then he discovered something that no amount of battlefield brilliance could solve. Rome kept raising new armies. Every time he won, a new Roman force appeared. He reportedly observed that another such victory would destroy him. The term Pyrrhic victory had been in everyday use for over 2,000 years. That's how well that observation captured something true. Rome defeated Pyrrhus by 275 BCE and secured its dominance over southern Italy and found itself, for the first time, in direct geographic proximity to Sicily, which meant for the first time in the outer orbit of Carthaginian strategic interests. The collision course had been set. In 289 BCE, the tyrant Agathocles of Syracuse died, and Sicily promptly descended back into chronic political chaos that had defined it for generations. Into this vacuum stepped the Mamertines, a group of Italian mercenaries who had seized the city of Messina in northeastern Sicily and were raiding surrounding territories with considerable enthusiasm. When Syracuse finally moved to suppress them, the Mamertines did something that would change the course of history. They sent appeals for help simultaneously to both Rome and Carthage. Carthage arrived first, inserting a garrison into Messina. Rome arrived second. And here's the thing. The Mamertines were Italian. Culturally, linguistically, they felt closer to Rome than to Carthage. So they expelled the Carthaginian garrison and aligned themselves with Rome. The Carthaginian commander, who had just been humiliated by this turn of events, returned home and was crucified. This is worth noting because it's not an isolated incident. Carthaginian military culture in this period routinely executed commanders for defeat or perceived failure. It's a pattern that tells you something about the political pressures operating at the top of Carthaginian decision-making, and it may help explain some of the command failures that followed. From Carthage's perspective, this was the nightmare scenario materializing. Rome was now in Sicily. Carthage and Syracuse, despite being long-standing rivals, formed an alliance against the Roman presence. Rome sent a negotiating offer. Both declined. The First Punic War had begun. And here's the point we're dwelling on. If the 306 BCE treaty existed and Rome had just violated it, Roman historians had every reason to pretend it never happened. The convenience of their amnesia is almost too perfect. The opening phase of the war moved quickly. Rome had sent approximately 16,000 troops to Sicily and defeated the Syracusans and the Carthaginians in separate engagements. Critically, Carthage failed to coordinate with its new ally. When Rome attacked Syracuse first, Carthage stood back, apparently expecting the city walls to hold. Syracuse read the situation correctly, made peace with Rome almost immediately, and then switched sides. Rome had shattered the alliance before it could function. What followed is one of the great strategic paradoxes of ancient history. Carthage was the Mediterranean's dominant naval power. Rome had virtually no navy at all. Carthage should have been able to strangle Rome's ability to supply and reinforce its forces in Sicily simply by controlling the narrow strait between the island and the Italian mainland. A competent naval power should have been able to make it impassable. It largely failed to do so. A constant pattern of poor strategic decision-making at the highest levels of Carthaginian leadership throughout this war. It makes me wonder about the previous harsh punishments imposed on Carthaginian leaders. Is it possible that they had killed a great leader or a group of leaders that would have prevented this gross mismanagement from happening in the first place? Playing the what-if game is an interesting but probably pointless concept, but it goes to show you how poor decision-making can have fatal consequences down the road. Rome's response was characteristically pragmatic. When Roman forces captured the Carthaginian quinquereme, a warship with 5 banks of oars, the most sophisticated naval technology of its age, Roman engineers reverse engineered it and began building their own fleet. The results were initially rough. Roman shipbuilding lacked the precision of the Phoenician construction techniques developed over centuries. And I say Phoenician in this point because don't forget the Carthaginians had derived their culture from Phoenician colonies. Roman sailors had none of the seamanship that Carthaginian crews absorbed from birth in a maritime civilization. Rome was starting from scratch and moving down a steep learning curve. Here's something worth appreciating about Carthaginian shipbuilding, because it's genuinely extraordinary. Ancient sources, including Pliny the Elder, reported that Carthaginian shipyards could construct over 200 vessels in under 2 months. For a long time, historians dismissed this exaggeration. Then archaeologists discovered a Phoenician shipwreck, and what they found changed their assessment entirely. The ship's components were prefabricated and pre-marked, built in separate locations, and assembled at final construction, each piece coded for its position in the finished vessel. This was a standardized modular production system, an assembly line. More than 2,000 years before Henry Ford and the Model T, Phoenician civilization had figured out how to apply industrial logic to shipbuilding. The Phoenicians weren't just great sailors, they were great manufacturers. And that information was passed down to the Carthaginians. Rome couldn't match this technique, at least not yet. So Rome did what Rome had always done when it was outmatched tactically. It found a way to convert the contest into something it was better at. The result was the Corvus, a hinged boarding ship fitted with a heavy iron spike. When a Roman ship got close enough to the Carthaginian vessel, The Corvus dropped, the spike drove into the enemy deck, and the Roman Marines stormed across and fought the kind of close quarters infantry engagement they had been trained for since childhood. Naval combat suddenly looked a lot like land combat. And in land combat, Rome was very, very good. It worked. At the Battle of Mylae in 260 BCE, Rome handed Carthage a significant naval defeat. But the Corvus had a critical weakness that would eventually reveal itself. It was top-heavy, making ships dangerously unstable in rough seas. Storm losses were catastrophic. After 256 BCE, the Corvus disappears entirely from the historical record. The Roman Navy had learned the hard way that a weapon that sinks your own fleet in bad weather has limited strategic value. This is probably the right moment to talk about what all this was doing to both economies, because the First Punic War didn't just reshape the Mediterranean geographically. It reshaped both the monetary systems in ways that would echo for centuries. Wars are expensive. Soldiers need food, supplies, and weapons. Supply lines need to be maintained across hundreds of miles of hostile territory or open seas. And when wars go on for years, as this one did, the question on how to pay for it becomes as strategically important as any battlefield decision. Governing states that believe they must not just fight, but win, eventually arrive at the same two options. At the scale of ancient war, taxes are rarely sufficient, which means the temptation to mint more money becomes almost irresistible. For Rome, this created an immediate problem. In the early decades of the First Punic War, Rome's monetary system was built primarily around bronze. Bronze works reasonably well as a currency in a society with limited access to it. Scarcity is what drives its value. The problem is that bronze is not particularly scarce. And when war breaks out and discipline goes out the window, the supply of bronze coins expands rapidly. The money floods the markets, the money loses value. Rome's bronze monetary standards began to fall apart under exactly this pressure during the Second Punic War. But the seeds of the problem were planted in the first. Silver was already being minted in Rome, but used less frequently than bronze. The shift would accelerate, and the reason it accelerated tells you something important about the nature of ancient commerce. Rome's most significant trading partners at the time were the Greeks, who had been long using silver coins for several centuries. Their economy was built on silver. Trading with the Greeks meant operating in silver. And so Rome, by the simple logic of commercial necessity, began moving towards silver as its monetary base. The Iberian silver mines that Carthage controlled, one of its most important strategic assets, were flowing enormous quantities of metal into the Carthaginian war machine. Rome, by contrast, was metal poor. This asymmetry would shape the war in ways that weren't obvious from the military history alone. In a modern sense, a lot of what comes down to modern wars is who controls the oil. In this particular case, it came down to who controlled the silver. By the mid-250s BCE, the war had ground into a stalemate that was destroying both economies. Rome attempted to end it quickly by taking the war directly to Africa, a bold strategic gamble that initially showed real promise. Carthage was caught unprepared for a land battle on home territory. Its hinterland was plundered, and the Libyan subjects began to revolt. Carthage had no choice but sued for peace. Then Rome overreached. The Roman commander demanded terms so severe, including the surrender of both Sicily and Sardinia, that Carthage couldn't accept them even under military pressure. Negotiations collapsed. Carthage turned its African defense over to a Spartan mercenary commander named Xanthippus, whose professional competence transformed the situation almost immediately. The Roman forces were routed and expelled from Africa. Rome had been offered a reasonable peace, turned it down out of hubris, and paid a severe price. Meanwhile, in Sicily, Carthage had settled into a guerrilla strategy under a commander whose nickname had become famous across the Mediterranean. Hamilcar Barca, Barca meaning lightning, was so disrupting Roman supply lines, ambushing Roman columns, and making conventional military operations against Carthaginian strongholds essentially impossible. He couldn't win the war this way, but he could make it really tough on the Romans. And this became a problem for both sides because both sides were generally catastrophically broke. Rome's Senate, unable to fund a new fleet through conventional means, did something remarkable. It asked the wealthiest citizens to personally finance the construction of new warships, promising repayment from Carthaginian reparations after victory. It was essentially a war bond issued by social pressure. Roman aristocrats funded the fleet that would end the war. Carthage, for its part, sent ambassadors to Ptolemy II of Egypt seeking a loan. Ptolemy refused. He had no interest in antagonizing Rome by financing its enemy. Carthage was on its own. The new Roman fleet established a blockade of Carthaginian positions in Sicily. When Carthage assembled a relief fleet, it was destroyed at the Battle of the Agates Islands in 241 BCE. With no fleet, no money, and no prospect for relief, Carthage had no choice but to sue for peace on whatever terms Rome was willing to offer. The terms were very severe. Carthage surrendered Sicily and the surrounding islands entirely. It agreed to pay 1,000 talents immediately and a further 2,200 talents over 10 years, which was approximately 96 metric tons of silver. Neither side could attack each other's allies or recruit soldiers from its other's territory. And notably, Rome did not ban Carthaginian trade with Sicily or Italy. That's a pragmatic acknowledgement that commerce between the two economies had been genuinely beneficial and would likely continue to be so regardless of the military outcome. Even in victory, Rome understood that killing trade was bad for Rome. Carthage had lost its most strategically vital possessions, its naval reputation, and nearly its solvency. It was far from finished. The names Hamilcar, Hasdrubal, and Hannibal would make that spectacularly clear. But nothing would ever fully return Carthage to the Mediterranean dominance it had before 264 BCE. The end of the First Punic War did not bring Carthage relief. It brought a new crisis that nearly finished what Rome had started. Approximately 20,000 mercenary soldiers returned to Africa expecting payment for years of service. Carthage, effectively bankrupt, sent negotiators, not Hamilcar, whose personal reputation with the troops might have given the talks a fighting chance, but less distinguished officials to propose reduced settlements. The soldiers refused. They marched on Tunis, seized it, and demanded full pay. An initial agreement was reached. Then a faction within the mercenary leadership did the math, decided that plundering Carthage itself would be much more profitable than negotiating wages, and launched a full-scale rebellion. The revolt spread rapidly. Libyan subject populations, long resentful of Carthaginian taxation, joined in. Mercenary forces in Sardinia rebelled and seized the entire island. Carthage found itself under siege, outnumbered, and nearly broke. The Carthaginian political system eventually cut through this dysfunction in a striking way. It allowed the soldiers themselves to choose their commander. They chose Hamilcar by acclamation. He maneuvered the rebel forces into a mountain enclosure, sealed the exits, and waited. By 237 BCE, every rebel city and territory had recovered. Rome's conduct during this episode was revealing. It initially allowed Carthage to recruit soldiers from Italy and freed Carthaginian prisoners, practical assistance that reflected a residual interest in Carthaginian stability. But when mercenary forces in Sardinia appealed to Rome for annexation, Rome took the island and threatened to renew the war if Carthage objected. Carthage, in no position to resist, accepted the loss and paid an additional indemnity. It was an opportunistic seizure that Carthaginian memory would not forget. Hamilcar certainly didn't. In 237 BCE, Hamilcar led Carthage's return to the Iberian Peninsula. Accompanying him were his son-in-law, Hasdrubal, and his young son, Hannibal, who, according to ancient tradition, had begged his father to be taken along and swore an oath that he would never be a friend to Rome. For Hamilcar, he regarded Rome as an oath-breaking imperial power that had stolen Sardinia and Corsica during Carthage's moment of maximum vulnerability. He intended to rebuild Carthaginian power in Spain and present Rome with a reckoning. He just wouldn't live to see it. Hamilcar was killed in 229 BCE in a battle against an Iberian tribe. Hasdrubal succeeded him. He founded Cartagena, New Carthage, as the administrative capital of Carthaginian Iberia, and began sending back to his home city what it desperately needed: silver, horses, and manpower. Spain was, in practical terms, the ideal platform for rebuilding an ancient economy. The Iberian Peninsula was extraordinarily rich in silver, which Carthage extracted through state-owned mines operated by private contractors, a system that maximized output while distributing administrative burden. The silver flowing from Spanish mines refilled the Carthaginian treasury and produced coinage of notably higher quality than the debased currency that the state had been forced to issue during the lean years of the First Punic War. Beyond silver, Spain provided manpower, eventually around 60,000 infantry and 8,000 cavalry. Rome had noticed. A diplomatic boundary was established. Hasdrubal agreed not to push Carthaginian expansion north of the Ebro River. It suited him fine. His interests were in the south. Then, in 221 BCE, Hasdrubal was assassinated, and everything changed. Hannibal Barca was in his mid-20s when he assumed command of the Carthaginian forces in Spain. He was already an experienced soldier who had spent his formidable years on military campaign. And he proved almost immediately to be something extraordinary, a general of the kind that history produces perhaps once every century or two. Within 2 years, he had defeated multiple Iberian armies and roughly doubled the territory under Carthaginian control. He pushed steadily northward. Rome grew concerned, and then in 219 BCE, Hannibal besieged Saguntum, a city Rome considered an ally. For several months, Rome debated rather than acted. 7 months. Saguntum fell. Rome dispatched an embassy to Carthage demanding Hannibal be handed over for punishment. The Carthaginian Senate refused. The Second Punic War had begun. What makes this moment genuinely fascinating is that both economies were flourishing through mutual trade at the precise moment the war was declared. The parallel to August 1914 is not unreasonable. Britain and Germany were each other's second largest trading partners on the eve of the war that would devastate both. It was driven not by economic logic, but by an accumulated mistrust, colonial competition, and the momentum of military preparation. By the outbreak of the Second Punic War, Carthage had assembled approximately 125,000 soldiers, nearly double Rome's estimated 71,000. Rome, however, had a decisive naval advantage, with a fleet roughly twice the size of Carthage's. And here's the strategic irony that shapes everything that follows. Carthage, the great maritime civilization, the heir of the Phoenicians, was now the superior land power. Rome, which had entered the First Punic War without a meaningful navy, was now the naval power. The strategic strengths of both civilizations had been completely inverted. This is why Hannibal crossed the Alps. Carthage's navy had been destroyed in the First Punic War and was never fully rebuilt. Sailing to Italy against a superior Roman fleet would have been catastrophic. The overland route was extraordinarily dangerous, but it was the only viable option. In 218 BCE, one of history's most audacious military campaigns began. Rome's intelligence knew Hannibal was moving, but somewhere in Gaul, Rome had lost track of him. He avoided well-traveled roads, moving through territories with limited Roman sympathy, picking up Gallic allies as he went. When he emerged in northern Italy in November 218 BCE, the shock was not that he arrived. Rome knew he was coming, but no one knew exactly where he was until he was already there. The crossing had cost him heavily. By the time he reached northern Italy, his forces had shrunk to approximately 25,000 soldiers. Alpine crossings in late autumn are brutal under any circumstance. Cold, difficult terrain, hostile mountain tribes, disease, and desertion. The first major engagement came at the Ticino River, where the Roman commander Publius Cornelius Scipio, we'll be hearing that name again very soon, attempted to check Hannibal's advance. He was defeated and wounded. The psychological effect was immediate. Gallic tribes in the Po Valley, waiting to see which way the wind blew, switched allegiance to Hannibal. His force swelled to roughly 30,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry. Hannibal followed the battlefield victory with something equally important. He released his Roman prisoners of war without ransom. This was a deliberate political strategy borrowed from the Persian tradition of Cyrus the Great. The message was explicit. I am not here to conquer Italy. I am here to liberate Rome's allies from Roman domination. Join me. From Rome's perspective, this was potentially more dangerous than any cavalry charge. The entire edifice of Roman power in Italy rested on its loyalty of its alliance network. If Hannibal could peel away Rome's Italian allies, he could win the war without ever taking the city of Rome. Rome split its forces in an attempt to outflank and contain Hannibal. He evaded both columns with apparent ease, moving freely throughout central Italy, living off the land, systemically devastating the estates of Rome's Latin allies, partially for supplies, partially to provoke Rome into a premature engagement, and partially to demonstrate to those allies that Rome could not protect them. The decisive blow came at Lake Tissumene in the spring of 217 BCE. Hannibal had positioned his army in the hills overlooking a narrow defile along the lake's shores. He waited for early morning fog. When a Roman column marched into the pass, Hannibal's forces attacked from the high ground on both sides simultaneously. Approximately 15,000 Romans were killed in the space of a few hours, including the consul Gaius Flaminius. It was one of the worst defeats in Roman history. Rome's response was to appoint Quintus Fabius Maximus as dictator and implement a strategy of deliberate avoidance. Fabius grasped the underlying logic with clarity. Rome could not match Hannibal in open battle, but Hannibal could not storm Rome's walls, had no siege equipment, and operated far from reliable Carthaginian resupply, and needed dramatic victories to convince Italian allies to defect. deny him victory, and his political strategy fails. It was the right strategy, but it was also deeply, profoundly unpopular in Rome, where it was characterized as cowardice unworthy of Roman dignity. The parallel to George Washington is genuinely illuminating. Washington quickly recognized that the Continental Army could not match the British in conventional pitched battles. His strategy became stay alive, avoid decisive defeat, and deny the enemy the knockout blow, and let time and attrition do the work. Fabius was doing something structurally similar, accepting the political cost of appearing weak in order to pursue a strategy that could actually work. Both men understood that sometimes not losing is the most important form of winning. The political pressure in Rome eventually became overwhelming. The Senate authorized a massive army of approximately 86,000 men, the largest Rome had ever fielded, with orders to find Hannibal and destroy him. On August 2, 216 BCE, they found him near the village of Cani in southeastern Italy. What happened next is studied in military academies to this very day. Despite Rome's enormous numerical advantage, Hannibal had a decisive superiority in cavalry. He arranged his army with the weakest infantry in the center and the best cavalry on both sides. When the Roman legions advanced and pushed his center back, they packed themselves tighter and tighter in pursuit, exactly as Hannibal had intended. While the center bent, both wings of the Carthaginian cavalry routed their Roman counterparts and swung around behind the Roman army. The encirclement was complete. What followed was slaughter. Approximately 50,000 Romans were killed, including a staggering proportion of the senatorial and equestrian classes. Roughly 19,000 were captured, perhaps 15,000 escaped. In less than 3 years of campaigning in Italy, Rome had potentially lost over 100,000 soldiers. Now stop and sit on that number for a moment. In a society of perhaps 4 to 5 million people, this is catastrophic. The senatorial class, the governing elite, had just watched a generation of its members die in a few hours on a dusty plain in southern Italy. Rome had expected Hannibal to march on the city. He was 4 days away. He had just obliterated the largest Roman army in history. The city was in panic. And he did not come. So for a second time, Hannibal chose not to march on Rome. His reasoning was consistent. Rome's walls were formidable. He had no siege equipment, and his strategy remained fundamentally political, breaking the alliance system, not storming the capital. He sent envoys offering peace. The Senate refused. Even after Cani, even after losing potentially 100,000 soldiers in 3 years, the Senate refused to negotiate. This is generally one of the most remarkable institutional responses in the history of warfare. Most ancient states would have collapsed under this kind of pressure. Rome did not. It refused to negotiate with Hannibal. It raised new armies. It resumed the Fabian strategy, and it waited. What tends to get lost in the military drama is what happened to Rome's economy during these years, because it was, in a word, catastrophic. In 216 BCE, when Rome could not pay its troops after Cani, it reached out to foreign rulers for a loan, borrowing from Hiron of Syracuse and then defaulting. It could not pay the public contractors supplying its armies and constructing its state buildings. It raided widows and orphan funds. It levied a wealth tax. In 210 BCE, it simply begged its wealthiest citizens for loans. By 205 BCE, it had sold off state property in Campania. The Roman government was, by any reasonable measure, almost broke. And yet, the financial brinksmanship worked, because Rome was doing something else at the very same time, something that would prove to be one of the most consequential monetary decisions in ancient history. In 210 BCE, Rome struck the denarius. The denarius was a small, convenient silver coin, a dramatic improvement over what Rome had been using. The switch was partly driven by the same commercial logic that had been building for decades. Rome's most significant trading partners, the Greeks, had been using silver coins for centuries. Their economy was silver-based. Trading with the Greeks required operating in silver. But the denarius wasn't just a concession to the Greek commercial practice. It became the backbone of the Roman economy for over 5 centuries, and eventually a pan-Mediterranean monetary standard. To understand what a leap this was, consider what came before. Roman metallic currency began with iron rods, then it gave way to bronze scrap metal, and then eventually evolved into large bronze discs. A pocket full of discs weighed about a pound. Any military operation had to include logistics plans, not just to move soldiers to the battlefield, but also to transport the currency to pay them. The denarius was worth about 10 bronze discs and weighed a fraction of that. It was a monetary upgrade of the first order, and it arrived precisely at the moment when Rome needed it most. But there was a problem. To mint silver coins at scale, you needed large amounts of silver, and Rome was silver poor. Athens had its Laurian mines, Carthage had Spain, Rome had neither. This asymmetry had a strategic disadvantage from the beginning of overseas wars. The Second Punic War and its aftermath would change everything. While Hannibal held southern Italy in a kind of unresolvable military stalemate, Rome was doing something critically important in Spain. As long as Rome could deny Hannibal reinforcements and resupply from the Iberian Peninsula, his position was ultimately unsustainable. He was fighting a war of attrition in Italy with no way to replace his losses. Rome sent a young general to Spain who would prove to be Hannibal's equal, arguably his superior in strategic vision. His name was Publius Cornelius Scipio. He was the son of the Roman commander Hannibal had defeated at the Ticino River. He had fought at Cannae and survived. He was about to become one of the most consequential figures in the ancient world. In 209 BCE, Scipio attacked Cartagena, Carthage's Spanish capital, and took it with minimal resistance. The city's fall triggered a cascade of Iberian defections. Carthage's primary western resource base was collapsing. And with it went the silver mines that had been funding the entire Barcid project. Hannibal's response was to send his brother Hasdrubal on a march from Spain to Italy to link up with him, effectively conceding Spain in exchange for the chance to unite the two Barcid armies. It was a desperate gamble. Hasdrubal made the crossing of the Alps, reached northern Italy, and sent messengers south to coordinate with his brother. The messengers were intercepted. Roman commanders, determined to prevent Hannibal from learning the news through conventional channels, did something that speaks to the particular Roman understanding of psychological warfare. They put Hasdrubal's severed head in a bag and sent it to Hannibal's camp in the south. When it arrived, Hannibal reportedly looked at his brother's face and said something to the effect that now he understood his fate. A third brother, Mago, attempted his own march to Italy in 205 BCE. He arrived too far north, too late, and with too few men. He was defeated and died of wounds sustained in battle. Hannibal was now alone in southern Italy. No reinforcements, no resupply, and no prospect of relief. In 204 BCE, Scipio did what he had been planning for years. He carried the war to Africa. In 203 BCE, he inflicted two decisive defeats on Carthaginian and Numidian forces, knocking Numidia out of the war and severing Carthage's most important remaining military alliance. With Roman forces threatening Carthage directly, Hannibal was recalled. After 15 years of undefeated campaigns on Roman soil, an extraordinary military achievement that had simply failed to break Rome's will. The two men reportedly met before the final battle. Ancient sources suggest that Scipio saw a man visibly worn by years of campaigning. He was one-eyed, aging, and appeared exhausted. Whatever mutual respect passed between them, peace talks collapsed. The Battle of Zama in 202 BCE was Cannae in reverse. Scipio used Hannibal's own tactical methods against him: the double envelopment, the encirclement. The Carthaginian army was routed. Hannibal escaped but returned to Carthage and earned the city's leadership to accept peace at any cost. By 201 BCE, the Second Punic War was over. Scipio's settlement was designed to make sure this never happened again. Tens of thousands of talents payable over 50 years. A navy reduced to 10 ships. No war outside of Africa without Roman's permission. No war inside Africa without Roman authorization. Numidian allies received territorial grants from former Carthaginian lands, creating a deliberately ambiguous border that would generate chronic disputes. And Scipio did not demand Hannibal's surrender. The reasons were never recorded, whatever its basis, whether it was respect, political calculation, or something more personal, but the omission is striking. The military outcome of the Second Punic War is well known. What is less often told is what it did to Rome's economy, and the answer is it transformed it completely. With the defeat of Hannibal in 202 BCE, Carthage was stripped of its colonies and settled with enormous tributes. The Carthaginian silver and gold mines of Iberia were transferred to Roman control. Roman entrepreneurs swarmed west to exploit them. The economic consequences was a dramatic increase in the Roman money supply. Rome went, in the space of a generation, from metal poor to metal rich. As the historian Philip K. argued, the Second Punic War represented, for Rome, an economic revolution. It wasn't just that Rome won the war, it's that winning the war gave Rome access to the mineral wealth that made everything that followed possible. Access to Iberian silver set Rome on a path of domination over the Mediterranean world, just as the Illyrian silver mines had once fueled the Athenian naval supremacy. The power of money gave Rome the power to pay its armies and navies, and create a currency that would come to dominate the global marketplace. Interestingly, the Iberian mining operations were not monopolized by the large publican societies that dominated other sectors of Roman state contracting. Roman entrepreneurs of all sorts got into the mining trade. Government regulators established rules of how small-scale companies could operate. And surviving examples of these rules suggest that smaller share companies, evidently with a form of limited liability, also existed alongside the larger publican firms. A range of different organizational forms emerged to exploit the mineral wealth of Iberia. This variety very rapidly led to monetary expansion. The effect on everyday commerce was immediate. Silver money stimulated the economy, gave it liquidity, and fostered trade, market development, and specialization in manufacturing. Before the introduction of silver coins at scale, a limited supply of money and the friction caused by poor monetary technology, the heavy bronze coins, essentially was a drag on the economy. Iberian silver removed those constraints. The Roman monetary system became a valuable technology in its own right, not just a way of paying armies, but a platform for economic growth across the entire Mediterranean world. But here's something that the purely military history almost always misses. Coinage was only part of the story. The Roman economy is increasingly operated through a parallel system that didn't require coins at all. The historian William Harris noted that Rome's money supply also grew in the virtual realm through the rapid expansion of credit institutions like banks and investment organizations. For an empire centered on hazardous sea transportation, metallic currency posed a structural risk. Coins that went down with a ship were gone forever. Coins buried before battle by soldiers who didn't come home were lost forever. Coins worn down through long use lost weight and value. The physical money supply was constantly leaking. Banking and lending expanded the effective money supply beyond the physical limits of coinage. Letters of credits, deposit accounts, commercial loans, investment partnerships. These allowed Roman merchants and state contractors to operate across vast distances without physically moving silver from one place to another. Some of Rome's merchants in this period were called argentari, a kind of moneylender who also served as an insurer for depositors' savings. This matters for a simple reason. Without money of account, and without financial institutions facilitating investment in long-distance trade, Rome could not have filled its vast armies and maintained a geographically extended empire that relied on shipping commodities across the sea. Finance was not a sideshow to Roman imperial expansion. It was the lifeblood. Rome became an empire because of its financial technology. Coinage, yes, but also the investment and the credit institutions that multiplied the power of the coinage many times over. The 10 ships Carthage retained after Zama were triremes, fast, capable vessels suited for a commercial escort. Whether this was deliberate generosity or strategic oversight on Scipio's part, it gave Carthage exactly what it needed to rebuild its commercial network. The recovery was, to put it mildly, faster than anyone in Rome had anticipated. Within a decade, Carthaginian merchants had re-established trade routes across the Mediterranean, reaching Italy, Spain, Greece, the Balkans, and according to some sources, as far as the Atlantic. Agricultural productivity recovered. And then, in 191 BCE, Carthage did something that sent a visible shockwave through the Roman Senate. It offered to pay the full balance of its 50-year indemnity in full. Rome refused, not because it needed to decline the money. Rome was actually engaged in expensive Eastern wars at the time and could have used it. Rome refused because the annual payment was an annual demonstration of its dominance. Accepting early settlements would have surrendered that symbolism. Carthage's prosperity made Rome deeply, instinctively uncomfortable. In 196 BCE, Hannibal assumed political leadership in Carthage and immediately did what any competent reformer would do with a state that had just survived 2 catastrophic wars. He audited the books. What he found was extensive embezzlement and fraud. He recovered the stolen funds, reformed the government to allow direct citizen election of senior officials. He banned consecutive terms in office and made meaningful inroads against oligarchic entrenchment. The Carthaginian economy responded. The city grew visibly more prosperous. Rome noticed. Using Numidia as a proxy, Rome accused Carthage of territorial encroachment and began applying pressure on Hannibal personally. Recognizing that Roman accusations were likely a prelude to demands for his extradition, Hannibal fled east and spent his remaining years as a military consultant to rulers across the eastern Mediterranean who maintained their own grievances against Rome. He died in 183 BCE, reportedly by suicide to avoid capture, having never returned to Carthage. Some historians have called him the last major figure of the Hellenistic resistance to Rome. and it's not a bad epithet. I know it sounds strange to say he was the last Hellenic resistance because he actually spoke Greek. And even though he was Carthaginian, he was basically raised in the Greek ways. By the mid-2nd century BCE, Carthage had done something Rome found almost offensive. It had rebuilt itself into one of the wealthiest cities in the Mediterranean world. Its population may have reached 250,000 people. Its commercial network stretched across the Mediterranean and possibly into the Atlantic. It had constructed the Kothon, a circular harbor capable of sheltering up to 220 ships, protecting them from both attack and storm, unlike anything else in the ancient world. Into this context came the Roman senator Cato the Elder, an elderly veteran of the Second Punic War, a man who had spent years warning Rome against Carthaginian resilience. He visited Carthage as part of a diplomatic delegation and came back visibly shaken. He had expected to find a diminished former enemy. He found a city that was possibly richer than Rome itself. From that point forward, Cato ended every speech he delivered in the Senate with the same declaration, regardless of the topic under discussion: Carthago delante est. Carthage must be destroyed. He said it when discussing grain prices. He said it when debating road construction. He said it after speeches about water rights and senatorial procedure. Every speech, for years. It became a kind of dark running joke in Rome, and also slowly a form of permission. The chronic border disputes between Carthage and Numidia after the Second Punic War are, in retrospect, the slow mechanism of Rome's final decision. Rome constantly ruled in Numidia's favor. By 151 BCE, Carthage had been effectively squeezed into northern Tunisia, its taxable agricultural base cut roughly in half. When it finally raised a modest army to resist Numidia raiding, Rome characterized the action as aggression against a Roman ally, a violation of peace terms prohibiting unauthorized warfare in Africa. Carthage sent envoys to Rome to make its case. Rome was not interested. The Senate had already decided. When Utica, Carthage's oldest Phoenician sister city, defected to Rome and offered a landing base for an invasion, the decision was final. So, in 149 BCE, Rome declared war. Polybius, who was present in Rome during this period, noted explicitly that the Senate was concerned about how its actions would appear to the Hellenistic world, and therefore took care to construct a legal cover for what was, in substance, a decision to eliminate a wealthy rival while it could still be done cleanly. The economic motive was not a secret. The completed indemnity payments had confirmed Carthaginian solvency. Cato's reports had made the city's wealth common knowledge in Rome. And the simultaneous destruction of Corinth, another wealthy maritime republic showing democratic tendencies, makes the pattern unmistakable. Both cities destroyed the same year. Both commercially sophisticated, neither a genuine military threat, both eliminated by a Roman oligarchy that had concluded that commercial wealth and maritime independence in the lands of rivals were threats more dangerous than any army. Rome sent 84,000 soldiers to Africa. Carthage offered unconditional surrender. It complied with Rome's first two demands: 300 hostages from leading families, followed by the surrender of all military equipment, including 200,000 sets of armor and 2,000 artillery pieces. Then came the third demand. The entire population was to abandon the city of Carthage and relocate 10 miles inland from the coast. Think about what that means. Carthage was a civilization that had been built around the sea for 600 years. Its economy, its identity, its culture, its history. All of this was inseparable from the harbor, the ships, and the sea routes that connected it to the world. Telling Carthage to move 10 miles inland was not a peace term. It was a sentence of civilizational death. It was Rome saying, "Stop being Carthage." Carthage refused. The city exploded. Italian residents were massacred. The entire population mobilized for war with whatever they had left, which after surrendering all their weapons and armor was not much. Ancient sources describe women cutting off the hair to provide fiber for catapult ropes. They had nothing. They built an army from nothing. The siege lasted 3 long years. In the spring of 146 BCE, the Romans breached the walls. The fighting continued street by street, house by house, through 6 days of brutal urban combat, until the survivors retreated to the Bursa citadel, the original hill on which Dido had reportedly found the city 6 centuries before, and held out for a final 7 days before surrendering. Approximately 50,000 survivors were sold into slavery. The city was burned. Its libraries were not preserved. Any artwork transported to Rome was cataloged as Greek, not Carthaginian, as if Carthage had never had a culture worth attributing. Polybius, who was present and watched the fire, recorded that Scipio Aemilius wept as Carthage burned. The victorious Roman general stood before the destruction of the city that had been surrendered and quoted the Iliad, the passage in which King Priam contemplates the inevitable fall of great cities, great peoples, great empires. He admitted to Polybius that he foresaw the same fate awaiting Rome. In the middle of the greatest triumph, Scipio Aemilius was mourning the city he had just destroyed and seeing his own civilization's future in its flames. Carthage and Corinth were both destroyed in 146 BCE. The timing was not coincidental. Both were commercially sophisticated maritime republics with democratic tendencies. Neither posed a serious military threat to Rome. Both were eliminated by the same Roman oligarchy in the same year. What they represented, and what made them dangerous, was not military power. It was a different model of civilization. Carthage had always reflected its Phoenician origins, preferring limited war, commercial alliances, and negotiated balance over hegemonic conquest. Its strategic culture was that of a merchant republic, a civilization that measured success by the balance sheet rather than the battlefield. Rome's strategic culture was something fundamentally different, an appetite for dominance that could not tolerate a successful rival, however peacefully that rival conducted itself. In the end, Carthage was not destroyed because it was dangerous. It was destroyed because it was successful. Rome subsequently resettled the site, recognizing with characteristic pragmaticism that abandoning the most productive agricultural land in the Western Mediterranean would be wasteful. Beginning in Caesar's time, a new Roman Carthage arose from the ruins of the old. It became one of the wealthiest cities in the Roman Empire. A fitting, if deeply bitter, postscript to the civilization that Rome had worked so methodically to erase. The Punic Wars also left their mark on the Roman economy. Prices rose temporarily in the range of 3 to 4% during the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE, though these were short-lived fluctuations rather than sustained inflation. The wars had consumed enormous wealth and restructured Mediterranean trade flows in ways that took generations to stabilize. Rome had won, but winning had cost something too. What it had gained, though, was something no one fully appreciated at the time: access to Iberian silver. a hard currency that worked, a banking and credit system sophisticated enough to move money across an empire, and the financial infrastructure to sustain the most powerful military organization the ancient world had ever seen. As one historian put it, Rome became an empire not just because of its legions, because of its financial technology. Finance was not a sideshow, it was the lifeblood. That's a wrap on this episode. We covered a lot of ground today. 3 centuries of rivalry, 3 wars, the near destruction of Rome, and the actual destruction of Carthage, and the financial revolution that turned a city-state into a world empire. Over the next few episodes, we'll follow what happened to that empire, and the monetary system that built it, as Rome begins to strain under its own weight. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the best thing you can do is leave a 5-star review and pass it along to someone who would appreciate it. Word of mouth is everything for an independent show like this one. You can support the podcast directly by going to patreon.com/history of money banking trade, or you can visit our website at moneybankingtrade.com. Until next time, I am Mike D, and this has been the history of money, banking, and trade.